Today, we're going to talk about a single day in Uganda's history. A day that started out just like any other, but ended in a tragedy that's, well, it's almost impossible to fully wrap your head around. This is the story of the Atiak Massacre.
And really, the whole story of that day comes down to this incredible, devastating contrast. You start at dawn with the simple, familiar rhythm of life. People going to work, kids getting ready for school, and then by sunset, you have one of the worst massacres in the country's history. So the real question is, how on earth did things go so wrong, so fast?
So let's actually go there, to that morning. We're in the Atiak Trading Center on April 20th, 1995. You can just picture it, right? A busy, bustling little community, a typical small town just waking up and getting on with its day.
And that, right there, is the most chilling part of all of this. This wasn't a town on high alert. There were no warning signs, no feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It was the absolute, total normalcy of it all that came right before the absolute devastation.
And this brings us to the exact moment that everything changed. See, there was a long-running conflict happening in northern Uganda, and it was about to show up not just at the town's doorstep, but right inside its homes.
To really get what happened, you have to know who we're talking about. The group responsible was the Lord's Resistance Army, or LRA. They were a notoriously brutal rebel group that had been terrorizing the region for years in this really violent insurgency against the government.
And we're not talking about a small raid here. Just after dawn, an overwhelming force, somewhere between 200 and 300 fighters, just swept into this unsuspecting town.
And this is a detail that is just so deeply tragic. The man leading the attack, the commander, was a man named Vincent Otti. He wasn't some stranger, an anonymous outsider. He was from Atiak. He grew up there. He was leading an army against the very place he was born.
From there, the attack started to build toward its central, horrific event. The story moves now to the Ayugi Valley, to a little place by the Kitong stream.
And what's so striking here is how cold and systematic it all was. This wasn't just chaos. First, they took out any resistance by overrunning the local government posts. Then, they started rounding up all the civilians. They marched them out of town, to the stream, and forced them all to the ground. Every single step was deliberate.
And their justification? Witnesses who survived remembered these words being spoken right before the shooting started. The rebels were directing this at the local Acholi people. They framed it as a punishment, a brutal lesson, because they claimed the community hadn't supported their cause.
And the scale of that so-called lesson is just staggering. When the gunfire finally stopped, more than 250 people were dead. I mean, just let that number sink in. An immense, devastating loss of life in just one afternoon.
And it's so important to understand who these victims were. This wasn't some battle between two armies. The victims were the very fabric of the Atiak community. They were students, with their whole lives ahead of them. They were parents, they were children. It was an indiscriminate killing of ordinary people.
So, what happens to a place after an event like this? The violence might stop, but the story is far from over. This is what came next. This is the aftermath.
The impact was just total. Survivors told these horrific stories of having to hide among the bodies of their own friends and family until the rebels finally left. The town itself, for all intents and purposes, died. It emptied out almost overnight as everyone fled. And for those who made it out, the trauma became this deep wound that would stay with them for decades.
And what about the commander, Vincent Otti, the man from Atiak who led this massacre? Well, he actually rose pretty high in the LRA, but reports say he was executed by his own organization years later, around 2007.
So, after all this time, why is it so important to tell this story? That really brings us to the legacy of Atiak, and to this vital, crucial act of not letting it just fade into some history book.
You see, remembering isn't just an idea, right? It's a physical thing. And in Atiak, it has taken the form of a memorial and a mass grave. It's a permanent, solemn marker of everything that was lost on that single day.
And this is how a memory is kept alive. The massacre happened in 1995. Today, that memorial stands on that same ground. And, crucially, every single year on April 20th, families and survivors gather there. They make an active choice together to remember.
So, this brings us to a really critical question. Given that this was all happening in the middle of a war, an insurgency, was what happened in Atiak just a battle?
And the answer is just no. An unambiguous no. It was a massacre. the deliberate, systematic killing of unarmed civilians.
And we're going to end with this really powerful thought. Why remember something so painful? Because remembering is an act of defiance. It's about ensuring that the silence that always follows violence doesn't get the final say. It's about honoring the victims by refusing to let their story disappear.